Good evening, everyone. Thank you for logging in after a long weekend. I hope you've managed to enjoy the last dregs of our summer here in the UK. I'm really pleased this evening that we are joined by two people that we work with very closely and that I know really well and are real experts in their fields. So we have with us tonight Nimrod Goren, who is the founder and the director of Mitvim, which is one of Israel's leading think tanks that focuses specifically on Israel and its foreign policy. And also with us is Yael Patir, who heads up the task force against annexation in Israel, and previously to that, until very recently, was the director of J Street Israel. And as I'm sure lots of you know, Yachad and J Street do a lot of work together, and Yael and I have been collaborating for a long time, so it's really great to have them both here tonight. We pulled together this webinar because, as I'm sure you have all been following, the deal between Israel and the UAE, which I think was signed a couple of weeks ago, was I guess a historic agreement, but came as quite a shock to quite a lot of people, probably not to some journalists who kind of knew it was in the background, but I think to those of us who were kind of following what was going on in Israel, particularly the potential threats of annexation looming, to suddenly kind of wake up, well not wake up, be told in the middle of the afternoon that it was suddenly off the table and instead a peace agreement of some kind was on the table was quite a surprise. And there are obviously significant implications for Israel, its relationship with its Arab neighbours, and definitely its relationship with the Palestinian people. And the purpose of the session tonight is to really unpick some of that and to give you an opportunity to ask two people who've been working on this issue for a long time some questions and get their perspectives and opinions. So the way we're going to do this is that we're going to have a conversation, the three of us, and then we're going to throw it open to Q&A from the floor. So for those of you who have not taken part in a Zoom webinar before, at the bottom of your screen is a Q&A box. If you have a question, if you can type it into that box, and we will do our best to get through the questions. And feel free to type them whenever you've got one, and if they're kind of relevant to the conversation we're having, I'll try and kind of bring them in as we go along. But there will be a kind of dedicated Q&A slot at the end of the session. So just to kick off, Nimrod, I wondered if you could just give us an overview of what the deal is for people who haven't followed the details, when it happened, how it happens, and just give us some kind of background info. That would be really helpful.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. It's a pleasure being here, and I appreciate the work that Yachad has been doing over the last years in the UK, and I'm glad about our partnership. So yes, it was a surprising set of good news, although when you dig into the background, you see that Israel-UAE relations have been evolving quite rapidly over the last few years, with the question actually being how high this relationship will go, how public it will be made, and when that will be happening. Just today, the first Israeli flight landed in Abu Dhabi, carrying director generals of key ministries in our government, almost the entire journalistic corps covering diplomatic affairs. And that plane is flying over Saudi Arabia, which gives flyover rights. It lands in Abu Dhabi with live coverage in the Emirati TV, with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Abu Dhabi, of the UAE, actually waiting in the airport, greeting the delegation, a lot of positive vibes, as if peace has already been signed months ago. We are only talking about an agreement that was announced 2 weeks ago. It was not even signed in an official ceremony. There was an announcement, there was an American announcement, an Israeli announcement, an Emirati announcement about normalizing relations. At first, there was a gap in the language used by both sides. Netanyahu was speaking very highly and immediately about peace. The Emiratis were a bit more reluctant, but they followed suit quite quickly. And now we are having an Arab country, the third Arab country to have official diplomatic ties with Israel, speaking about a peace agreement, speaking about warm peace, speaking about cooperation on civilian, economic, political, security affairs, and doing it all very much in the public. And that is very new, not only in terms of what we expected, but what kind of model of relations we're used to having with Arab countries who are willing to engage with us. The relations that Israel has with Egypt and Jordan are very different. Although there's a peace agreement for decades, they don't have this warmth that the Emiratis were immediately injecting into these ties. And the question for us is, how do we make sure that such an agreement does not come on the expense of prospects for Israeli-Palestinian peace? How it is not framed as an anti-Palestinian move, as some in the Israeli right are trying to do. And now eventually the fact that Israel now has a peace agreement with another country in the region can help us all move to broader peace in the Middle East.
Thanks. I think we definitely need to come back to this question of how it impacts on the Palestinian peace process, but or lack of peace process. I just wanted to ask Yael, because you've kind of been mobilizing the Israeli public against annexation. So for people who are campaigning against annexation and worried about the prospect of annexation, do people see this as a good thing or a bad thing? Because obviously it's taken annexation, at least temporarily, off the table.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks for leading Yachad and for putting this call together. It's really a pleasure. I was nodding my head when you said that probably some journalists knew about the agreement. So I received the announcement, not the announcement, sorry, I received a text message from an acquaintance that said there's going to be a big announcement coming from the Prime Minister office in an hour, and it has to do with annexation. And I gathered all of my staff because we gathered for a campaign against annexation, and I said there's going to be a big announcement in an hour. And I said, how do you know that it's about annexation? And he says, well, the Prime Minister's office told the journalists to hold, or told the editors to hold the first page of the newspapers, to hold space in the first page. And what I did immediately is I rang 3 journalists, all covering the diplomatic area. I don't want to shame them, but one of the biggest American newspapers was the head of the bureau in Israel, and 2 from the leading Israeli TV channels in Israel. They knew nothing. I was the one to tell them that something is coming up, and they had no idea. So this was managed to be kept in very secretly, and in fact, the negotiations between this triangle of the UAE, Israel, and the US over the statement that they published, and the process took about 8 weeks. And it was in the context of the fight for annexation, which is very important to highlight. So in fact, the annexation was sort of a chip, or a bargaining chip. As you said, I left my position with J Street to formalize a task force in Israel that worked against annexation, and we see ourselves as, victorious, because annexation is currently off the table, and my analysis is that it's off the table for a long while, although we are constantly getting different messages from the Prime Minister and his environment here. But I'm sure that it's off the table for at least a few years, let's say. And in that regard, since we really gathered to stop annexation, believing that unilateral annexation is the most dangerous thing that can happen to Israel at this time, the deal that is going to be signed, and the fact that it came with the promise that Israel is going to stop any policies in promoting annexation was, of course, very good news for us. It doesn't mean that the occupation stopped. It doesn't mean that there's any advancement in peace between Israel and the Palestinians, but on the very narrow mission that we had to stop annexation, indeed, it's good news.
Thank you. And so just to ask you both, so annexation is off the table, and you say that your analysis is that it's off for at least several years. But there's always constantly, when Netanyahu speaks at the moment, a kind of, for now, in a few months, and we might still do it in a few weeks, this kind of sense of we're not putting it to bed. And so I guess my question to both of you is, do you feel that that's him speaking to a part of his base, that he feels that he needs to just kind of constantly keep quiet by suggesting that it might happen, but it's never going to happen? Or do you think that there is a chance that he might, as Netanyahu often does, find a way to get back what he wants? Yeah, Nimrod, do you want to?
Yeah, I will agree with Yael. I think the option of annexation is off the table. That was a key condition in the negotiations between Israel, the UAE, and the US. The UAE was ready to move forward with Israel. It already did so. The context was a different one. The anticipation was that in October of this year, the Expo 2020 exhibition will open in Dubai with a big Israeli pavilion, reportedly with a temporary Israeli embassy following the Israeli participation in the exhibition. So the context of how do you establish diplomatic ties was not tied up to annexation at the beginning, but the moment the UAE identified an opportunity to link the two things together, to be able to sell the narrative of the UAE is now defending the two-state solution by taking off the table what they perceive as the biggest threat to the two-state solution, namely the annexation. That is something they immediately took. It was comfortable for Trump. It was comfortable for Netanyahu. Everybody was looking for a way out. And I think this way out is very clear. And beyond statements that Netanyahu says that are obscure, that are for political reasons, when you dig down into what has been agreed, then it's very clear that annexation will not be part of any policy of Netanyahu in the coming few years, because that will immediately jeopardize the entire deal with the Emiratis. And eventually, I don't think Netanyahu would have been so interested in actually practicing it. And now annexation is not everything, and Yael mentioned occupation continuing. Look at other things that he can continue doing on the ground via building settlements, etc., that are not titled as annexation. And these may continue with a different name, and these are dangerous as well.
I think I'll jump in and add that the issue with annexation is very interesting, and it's very tricky. Unilateral annexation was for years an agenda of the far right in Israel, of the settler rights, and it wasn't so much an agenda of the right, the traditional right, or the center right, the center right in Israel. And basically, what happened since the announcement of the Trump plan is this acceleration, and within a year, where we had 3 cycles of election, and Netanyahu presented annexation as his election promise, we saw this annexation, speeding up as a policy agenda in Israel, to where it finally was signed as an issue in the coalition agreement between Likud and Blue and White. The interesting thing that happened is that once we were reaching the July 1st date, which was the date when the government was supposedly able to start promoting annexation, one of the most significant, I would say, or loud campaigns came from the settler rights against the annexation plan. And I think that was one of the sort of the surprises of the last few months, because that was always their agenda. So why all of a sudden they're against annexation? And what they tried to do is to say, we are for annexation, which they call sovereignty, but we're against doing it as part of the Trump plan, which we perceive as a two-state solution plan. So in that context, Netanyahu also lost the base for the annexation plan. And once that was the case, I think also Netanyahu needed a ladder to climb off the tree. And the reason why he still talks about sovereignty, I think, is really an attempt to hold the base, as he said, and say, I haven't given up the plan. It's just we don't have the consent of the Americans right now, and we can't do it without the consent of the Americans. It was also in the coalition agreement, but it's still something that that I plan to do. And the interesting thing now is that Netanyahu, for the first time with this peace agreement, is moving in a way to the center, which is totally not what he's been doing in the last few years, where it was always to cling to his base. So that's, I don't know what exactly are his calculation, but that's an interesting shift that is happening now, and I think we will probably talk about it more, but people like us on the screen that are very committed to promoting peace between Israel and the Palestinians and promoting the two-state solution are need to figure out what is happening and what is our role with this new reality.
Can I ask, I'm assuming you're going to, well, we talked about it briefly before we went live, and I assume your answer is no, based on what you've said, but there have been some journalists particularly who've written quite extensively about the fact that the entire annexation thing was never going to happen, it was never really on the cards, and therefore the deal with the UAE is not a surprise at all because the whole thing has been orchestrated by Netanyahu from the beginning and it was never going to happen, and this is just part of his plan to never implement annexation. I'm guessing that both of you don't agree with that, but I'd be interested to know if you think there's any truth in the idea that Netanyahu never intended to annex to start with. Nimrod, I don't know if you want to jump in.
I don't think that's the case. I don't know what Netanyahu was intending to do. I think the big annexation, talking about Jordan Valley Plus, was not realistic. The damage that was made clear by Jordan, by other regional countries, by Europe, was very effective in the way. I still thought that Netanyahu could have gone for something that is a bit more symbolic, doing like Ma'ale Adumim, which would be considered as more of a consensus, saying this is a first step, we'll wait after the American election, and then we'll see what happens. That is a path he could have gone. It still would have been causing damage to Israel's foreign policy, but much less than a bigger one. Okay, you can see that so many actors and leaders in countries warned Israel of annexation, but none of them actually spelled out a concrete policy price that will be attributed from Israel. So there was a sense of some room for flexibility in terms of a smaller annexation that was worrying for us. Now, the point of time in which the deal with the UAE was reached was one that I think chances for annexation were already going down. So it's not as if the UAE stepped in at the peak of the campaign of the pro-annexation by Netanyahu. It was already dwindling down, and somehow the feeling is that it wasn't the real deal. They could have done that before without it. And I think that's something that was interesting at how it was framed, because the UAE and the Palestinian leadership have a lot of strain in their relationship. President Abbas and the leaders of the UAE are not on good terms for the last 5 years or so. The UAE is supporting Mohammed Ahlan as the one who will replace Abbas eventually as the Palestinian leader. Abu Mazen Abbas doesn't want that, doesn't like that. So there are a lot of tensions between the sides. Just a few weeks before the announcement was made, there was an op-ed by the Emirati ambassador in Washington, written in Hebrew in the Yediot Achronot, telling Israelis basically you have to choose between annexation and normalization. So the formula was already there. The UAE sent a plane to Ben Gurion Airport with the national symbols, presumably with medical assistance to the Palestinian Authority, which the Palestinian Authority refused to accept because it felt that the UAE is doing normalization on its back. So when we look at these calculations of how the UAE is framing the move as saving the Palestinian cause, and you dig down and you see how deep the resentment between the Palestinian Authority leadership and the UAE leadership is actually happening, then I think it raises question marks about how big the annexation motivation was there. But from our point of view, the fact that that was the outcome, that annexation is now off the table, that you have an Arab country committed to it and taking the credit for it, I think can be useful further on.
I think that one of the favorite sports in Israel is the sport of guessing what Netanyahu is planning to do, what he was planning to do. During the campaign that we ran, we literally sat every night analyzing and debating Netanyahu's moves, and then comes a moment where somebody says, we have to stop thinking about what he's going to do because we never know what he's going to do and we can't plan accordingly. But I think that the prism through which we have to look at Netanyahu's actions is his upcoming trial, and annexation, when it was first presented, I think, to the public by him, was really an attempt to buy himself immunity, by creating a coalition that cares enough about annexation that will do whatever, he asks for to get it. And I think that he really saw this American administration providing him with a historic opportunity that he wanted to grab seriously. And I have intelligence telling me that he did spend, one of the things that we highlighted in the campaign is what he did in the week after the, basically mid-July, when the COVID-19 in Israel was going down and a new government was formed. And he actually really did shift his focus to focus on annexation. And he had a lot of deliberations and conversations with the US, trying to get his way. But as Nimrod said, there were a number of factors. One of them I pointed to was the opposition from within his political camp. Other was the enormous international pressure that Yachad was part of mobilizing, which I think was significant. And it was definitely significant in influencing the calculus of the White House and their sort of appetite to provide Netanyahu with a green light to go towards annexation. So I think it was serious, but I think that also everything that Netanyahu does, I look at very cynically, as Anshel Pepper does, and many others. And so it's hard to see him fulfilling any of his promises.
Can I ask, there's quite a few questions in a minute about specifically the impact on kind of Palestinians, but just one further question about Netanyahu and the deal and the Americans. There's a question here from one of our audience, Linda, who's asking whether you think that things might change. How much is Netanyahu making a calculation about the American elections? And if Trump gets re-elected in November, I guess, does this give Netanyahu, but also Trump, a bit more of a green light to kind of do, he's got another 4 years to make a bad decision and for it to kind of be okay in the end. And whether either of you feel that there's a chance that what happens in the American elections may or may not swing kind of a decision to then go ahead and annex. And I guess to what extent that's also an American issue as opposed to just a Netanyahu calculation. And sorry, just to add one further part of her question I missed, which is that to what extent, well, I guess Jared Kushner, she's asking how influential is Jared Kushner in this, but I would also add, if you don't mind, Linda, to your question, David Friedman, that there are two quite significant characters behind the scenes in the American administration. And it's quite well known that David Friedman, particularly the American ambassador to Israel, has been really pushing the annexation stuff, and whether that dynamic may or may not change after November. And obviously, if Trump doesn't win, it's irrelevant. But
so first, Jared Kushner is now in Abu Dhabi, going in the same plane with the Israeli delegation and the American delegation, and he's the big star of this event from the American perspective. And I think it's not by chance. He was very influential in leading this process behind the scenes in Washington. It seems like he had good connection with the Emiratis, that he was really pushing back against David Friedman and his pro-annexation policies. So Jared Kushner apparently did not want to see the Trump peace plan basically limited to annexation only. And his view was a different one, to find a way in which the plan could be still on the table this way or another. So he was pushing for that, and maybe Yael could elaborate more on American politics. I think in terms of what it means, the American elections to this process, is the notion of how much support does Netanyahu get from Washington for the narrative that he's been presenting to Israelis since the summer of 2014, which means that Israel could go to normalization with the Arab world without paying any price on the Palestinian track. This language we heard first just after the war in Gaza in 2014 ended. That was when Netanyahu began to use this language. He was looking into the opportunities that the Arab Spring brought to Israel, basically trying to flip the Arab Peace Initiative. The Arab Peace Initiative spoke about first peace with the Palestinians and the Syrians, by the way, and then full normal ties. And Netanyahu is saying the other way could be possible. Arab states indicated that it may be true if Israel will be willing to do some steps towards the Palestinians. I think it was 2017, just when Trump was doing his first visit to the Middle East. There was a report in the Wall Street Journal about Saudi Arabia and some Arab states offering normalization steps with Israel in exchange for freezing settlements. As time went by, they were willing to give those steps without the progress on the Palestinian track. And that's a big change in what we see, and it challenges some of the basic assumptions that we had about this relationship. And I think the fact if Trump wins the elections in November, the notion that Netanyahu is now pushing very heavily in the Israeli domestic scene, peace for peace, not peace for anything else, that formula will be echoed much more in Washington. However, if there will be a democratic administration that cares about the Palestinian issue, that seeks to reestablish ties with the Palestinian Authority, to reposition the Americans once again as mediators in the peace process, then this formula will be changed. And then peace with the Arab Gulf states is okay, but it should be done in a context that also supports peacemaking with the Palestinians. And I think that's a change that we should advocate and look to empower and encourage.
Yeah, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I agree with everything. I want to add that it's, yes, American politics and the election are extremely significant. I think that if we will have another 4 years of Trump, then God knows, what happened to the world and to our region. But definitely, I would assume that the Trump plan will be the leading, still the framework through which the Trump administration would want to work, and they would want to promote normalization with other countries in the same way that it was promoted with the UAE, meaning not in the way that Nimrod just explained. And then I think that also annexation could be back on the table as a mean maybe to pressure the Palestinians further. We know that that's the policy of a Trump administration is to put as much pressure as possible, and that's their idea of how to reach peace. With putting one side on their, not even on their knees, begging that you would just not do worse things than what you already have. And if there's a Biden administration, then what we already hear from him is, first of all, a rollback of many of the decisions of the Trump administration, not including the decision to open an embassy in Jerusalem, but to restore aid, to open a consulate, and some other steps as well. And there will be a process of reviving or reestablishing the relationship with the Palestinians. It's important to say that the Palestinians they took a decision with this American administration that they're not engaging with them at all. And I think that they're just waiting for this administration to be over. If indeed they win and they have 4 more years, it's a big question mark what the Palestinians are going to do, because I don't think that they can keep this strategy for 4 more years. I don't think it's very beneficial for them, at least until now. And the other point that I want to make is that one of the questions that I think we were all asking is, how does annexation and the issue, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and now the peace agreement with the UAE plays into the American election? Meaning, does it help Trump, or does it harm him? So I think on the question of annexation, most of the reports show that there's really not a lot of interest amongst U.S. voters, and mainly when we look at these issues, we look at 2 blocks of voters. We look at the Jewish voters and we look at the Christian evangelical voters as those who are most who care most about the issue of Israel, or Israel and Palestine. So I think what we saw is that the issue of annexation doesn't really get you a lot of support if we're talking about Trump. And it's interesting, I don't know, I haven't seen any data, I don't know if Nimrod has, on whether this peace treaty is helping Trump. He definitely uses it in his rallies. He was recently quoted in one of the rallies saying that he opened the embassy in Jerusalem for the evangelicals. So he definitely sees this policy as something that he does to satisfy his base. The last sentence that I'll say is that what is interesting is that there's a lot of rhetoric around the agreement with the UAE that has to do with the relationship with the Muslims. Kushner said a few times that there's going to be access, praying access to the Haram al-Sharif, to the
Temple Mount.
Sorry?
Temple Mount in English.
Temple Mount, thank you, in Jewish terms. And that's also very interesting. I honestly, I can't wrap my head around how this peaceful, tolerant rhetoric towards Muslim, how it's viewed with the evangelical base, because they usually are not. They care very much about Christians in the Middle East, by the way, very much, but less so about Muslims, as far as I know. So. Hannah, we can't hear you.
Apologies. I still managed to not unmute myself in this new Zoom world. I wanted to ask you, there's been a lot of discussion and rhetoric about the UAE selling out the Palestinians. So this deal with the Israelis is a purely self-interested, the UAE, America, kind of Israel triangle, and they've all got their own self-interests. And actually, what it does to the Arab world is divide it, and it completely marginalizes the Palestinian people. And I wanted to ask you both to what extent you think that's true, and whether there's been a lot of discussion about which country is coming next. So we know that that they tried Sudan said no, but there's this kind of list of who's going to be next to declare their kind of peace agreement with Israel. If we're in a situation where Arab states are now coming forward to do, as you say, make peace before anything is given by the Israelis to the Palestinians. What does happen to the Palestinian people, and does that mean that there is a chance that they are now going to kind of indefinitely, the peace is off the table from their perspective, and that they're going to just indefinitely live kind of in occupied territory? Or is that kind of scaremongering?
So for the first part of your question, it's interesting to look at how Arab states responded to this development. Because the Palestinians are accusing the UAE of deviating from the common Arab position as identified in the Arab Peace Initiative. And before, the Palestinian Authority just issued a tweet about it this evening, about the plane landing in UAE. But when you look at the responses of other Arab countries, responses are overall positive. And some are very positive. Bahrain and Oman are very positive towards the UAE move. The Saudis are keeping quiet, but in practice are allowing El Al to fly over their land for the first time in order to reach the UAE. Jordan, Egypt are also not saying anything against it, supporting even slightly. So the notion is that the Palestinians are basically almost left alone. And there will be probably, it's a guess, but I assume there will be other Arab countries moving forward, perhaps not to the scope the UAE is moving, but after the ceremony at the White House that you can expect to happen within the next few weeks, between Israel and the UAE, I will not be surprised to see maybe Bahrain, maybe even Sudan, upgrade their relations with Israel. So the UAE will not be the only one. The UAE is significant because it's one of the most big success stories in the Arab world. It's a country that is very different than the Israeli stereotype of what an Arab country is. For years, the peace camp in Israel should have made effort to convince Israelis that it's worthwhile trying to reach peace with Arabs, because for many Israelis, Arabs are a failed nation. And then all of a sudden you see the UAE and it's one of the richest, most successful nations in the world. And the potential for cooperation is so big, and now so many Israelis are looking for opportunities to make money out of this deal. So it's a very different mindset. Now the Palestinians are finding themselves in such a context on the margins of that, and I think that's not going to change. It reflects the weakness of the Palestinian Authority in recent years. It didn't begin with the UAE. You did not see major international actors stand by the Palestinians throughout the administration of Trump, who was doing moves that were deliberately to weaken the Palestinian leadership. You know, there was saying here and there, but no one stepped up to Trump. When Trump issued the peace plan, there was not any counter plan being put on the table by anyone. So it's not the first instance in which the Palestinians do not have allies in the international community. I think part of the resentment toward the Palestinian Authority, for example, in Europe, is because people do not appreciate the policies of how Abbas conducts himself domestically. And that's, I think, a downside. Now, the change within the Palestinian people will eventually come one way or another when there is a change of leadership. And that's a place where the UAE and other countries, perhaps Egypt, will try to play a very important role in shaping. And that's where Mohammed Akhlan, the one that the EU is pushing forward as the next Palestinian leader, that may be something really significant if his candidacy will be being pushed not only by the UAE, perhaps by another Trump administration if we see one. So I would look there rather than what will happen in the short term under Abbas, because currently I don't see any country stepping up to defend the Palestinians, not in the Arab world, not in Europe, not elsewhere.
Yeah, it's a very painful reality. I want to add three things. One is that when I'm trying to be optimistic, I'm hopeful that the normalization agreement, as somebody, Ilan, wrote here in his question, rather than a peace agreement, that this agreement could be used as leverage. And you know, there's this theory that people prefer not to lose something that they have than to lose something that they don't have. So given that Israel will have now this agreement and this access and a taste of normalization and a taste of better relations with an Arab country and being more integrated in the region, I'm hopeful that the UAE would see their role, because they are celebrating the fact that they managed to take annexation off the table. They're also saying, I think in all the, at least forums that I've been in the last few weeks with people from the UAE, they've been saying very clearly that this agreement has nothing to do with the Palestinians. I mean, meaning that it serves their interest, and that they don't, and that, as Nimrod said earlier, they've managed to also bring in the two-state solution as part of the deal, but that's where their commitment ends. And I do hope that they would go further and that they would be able to leverage this as a way to further. I mean, putting pressure on Israel is very tricky. So I don't want to be too rosy about it. Europe has great relations with Israel, and they don't manage to put too much pressure on Israel to do the policies that they would like Israel to do, right? But nevertheless, I think that there is an opportunity here. And I was thinking that, that one of the things that would be extremely, I think, beneficial or helpful is that if people from the Emirates would come to Israel Palestine for a mission, an educational mission of the type that Yachad runs or that J Street runs, where they really come and get to learn about the conflict and get to learn about the occupation and get to be in the territories and see what it looks like, because I'm sure that the level of knowledge is extremely low, and that there is a lot of learning to be done. And I think that the kind of work that that really seriously that Yachad is doing, that J Street is doing, the kind of groups that Nimrod is inviting. Nimrod is also through Mitvim is working with a lot of regional players. So I think that there's now an open opportunity to start working with think tanks more openly in the UAE and educate them about the situation and see if they can be more helpful players on the Palestinian front.
So can I just to follow on from that, because you know, if the Palestinians don't really have the support of any of those countries, and it's now a case of in the future maybe it can be used as leverage as opposed to now. What does that mean practically on the ground? So there's a question here from Maggie who says, you know, so de jure annexation may be off the table, but the settlers are continuing with de facto annexation and nobody stops them. So, and her question specifically, isn't that an even greater obstacle to peace? So when we have the threat of annexation, we could turn around and say, this is a red line, you can't cross that red line, and you won't be able to make peace with any surrounding Arab countries if you do. And actually what we have discovered is that, as you both have said, that's not the case, that you can make peace with surrounding Arab countries and you can continue to, you know, to kind of de facto annex territory while you're doing it and you don't pay a price for it. And so I guess on a, you know, painting a very bleak picture, the UAE deal has proved that actually pressure doesn't make any difference and Israel can carry on doing what it likes. And again, it might not have been able to enshrine annexation in law, but nothing changes. And so, you know, what does that mean, you know, kind of for the future of the region if what has happened with the UAE may now happen with 3, 4, 5 other Arab countries? The kind of, you know, I always imagine, you know, the Palestinians are kind of standing on an iceberg, which is like rapidly melting, you know, kind of what's left for them. And can I just before you answer, just to say to all the participants, please do write your questions in the Q&A, because I'm just going to kind of throw them in as we're talking. So don't forget to ask if you've got one.
I would try to identify some of the positive developments that can turn the picture that you portray into a better one. First, I would look at the composition of the Israeli government. You know, all the criticism that we have, surely about Netanyahu, but also about Blue and White for joining his coalition, we see that the more moderate fraction within Blue and White managed to have an impact in its attempt to block annexation. You know, Gantz and Ashkenazi, as Minister of Defense and Minister of Foreign Affairs, they never opposed annexation in principle, but the fact was that they laid so many conditions and eventually lobbied against it via international partners. So they managed to influence the government positions on the Palestinian track, and they could do that on other issues as well if they want to, because they hold 2 very significant portfolios. Now, of course, we know that most probably Israel will head into early elections next year, so it's not sure how long they will be there, but within the immediate term, at least until there is a chance of another American administration that will be willing to put more pressure, or at least chart a different policy for Israel and Palestine, that could be a barrier from the steps that you described on enhanced settlement activity, etc. The other point is, I think, what is happening now between Israel and Europe. That's something that is very interesting to follow, because we know how big the tensions between the previous Netanyahu government and the European Union was. The language used by Netanyahu ministers against the EU was really horrible. Gabi Ashkenazi, as foreign minister, has reversed this mantra. He's speaking very positively about relation with Europe. He flew to Berlin to meet with the European Foreign Affairs just this week as his first foreign visit. And I think the notion of a possible relaunching of the Israeli-European Union high-level political dialogue via the Association Council will also be a place through which clear European messages against settlement and these type of activities could be conveyed in a better way than it was conveyed during the 8 years when such a mechanism was not in place. I think these are 2 developments that should be looked at. And also, you know, it's our role, Yael, myself, other organizations, to shape how the Israeli public views the thing. And how do you frame what is happening with the UAE in a pro-peace way? Meaning, the Israeli public is now talking again about peace, about hope, about regional cooperation, not about annexation, less about threats. The fact that Israel is much more accepted in the region, like Yael said, may create a more convenient space to talk about possible concession. It will be very difficult now to carry the story that Israel is living in a hostile neighborhood with all the countries around it wanting to diminish it. Okay, it's not the case anymore. So that developments can open up a space for conversation that is the role for Israeli civil society, pro-peace organization, plus pro-peace politicians to make and try and do the battle for the narrative that will dictate the next phase of the Israeli public discourse.
Yeah, do you want to add?
I don't think that I have something good to add here.
Okay, we've got a question here from Hamala who says I guess it's a slight follow-on to what we've just been discussing, but she's asking specifically how is it that how are we in this situation that other Arab states are happy to basically turn a blind eye to what's going on with the Palestinians? And specifically what she's kind of said is that they're allowing their fellow Arabs to continue being subject to a state of virtual occupation. So, you know, you can kind of see what's in it for Israel and for the UAE, but how has that kind of split developed in the Arab world where the Palestinians are kind of irrelevant in the discussion?
I'll tell you something. First of all, it's really it's important to say that it's not our role to represent the Palestinians, and that they are in a very weak position currently, and I think that they seriously have to revisit their strategy, really, because it's and a lot of the question marks around their handling of their situation, and mainly the divide between Hamas and Fatah, between Gaza and the West Bank, has been a prominent question mark, I think, for people who want to see progress. And not to say that Israel is not responsible. Israel is of course very, very much responsible for the situation of the Palestinians, but it's just it's just important to be said because there is a situation in which and I think the agreement with the UAE is just this big, balloon that burst, where they say we're not going to wait for the Palestinians. That's basically what they're saying. And Kushner is also saying, we're not going to wait for the Palestinians. We're not going to be, I'm quoting one of the conversations with somebody from the Emirates saying, we're not going to be held hostage by the Palestinians because of their situation. But another thing that I want to say is that in a conversation I had with an Egyptian diplomat, before he was leaving his post in the embassy in Tel Aviv, when I was asking him how he feels about annexation, and this was in one of the rounds, probably after Netanyahu was promising to annex the Jordan Valley and so on. And I said what the Egyptian thinks about it, and not to say that what he said was a representation of an official Egyptian position, but he basically says, so they will annex, and you'll end up living with the Palestinians in one state. It might take more, it might take less, but that reality will end up coming, and if that's what Israel wants, so that's what it will be. And I think that for me, that's the most worrying, the thing that I'm most worried about, which is that you use the description of the Palestinians standing on an ice that is melting. In a way, but in another way, no. The Palestinians are here, and they're half of the population between the river and the sea. They're people. Some of them live in very, very bad conditions. Some of them live in almost equal conditions to Jews that live in the region. And I think what is worrying for me is that we will be in this state of perpetual war that will end up with us losing Israel as I want to see it. And the Egyptians will say, oh, we don't care. We're not Zionists. We don't care so much about a Jewish state or a Jewish and democratic state, as well as our new friends from the Gulf, right? So it's really, so I'm ending what I said with, it's really up to the Palestinians to decide how much they want their state, and to really they need new leadership, they need new ideas. We, as a younger generation, although we're no longer young, Nimrod and Hannah and I think we've all been working on this for almost 20 years, maybe a little bit less, but but there's a new generation of leaders also that on both sides that need to come up and I can't stress enough how on the one hand we will have to end with a two-state solution, but on the other hand we really need to refigure how we get there, because what we've done until now is no longer working.
Thank you. If I can add, we had a policy dialogue at the Mitvim Institute with some key Jordanian figures. When we spoke about annexation, how they react to the threat to the Palestinians, what they said was that the only demonstration they saw against annexation was in Tel Aviv, not in Ramallah. Okay, if the Palestinians do not go to the street and fight, why do they expect us Jordanians, and the Jordanians care about the Palestinians and annexation? It's not the UAE. The Jordanians had a lot to lose from that. Why would they expect the Jordanians to go out? I think that's something that is a very popular position within the Arab world, but still, I would not say that the Arab world is selling out the Palestinians. No, the Palestinian issue is still a very clear limiting factor in shaping Israel-Arab relations. What the UAE did was an exception. When you look at Egypt, when you look at Jordan, when you look at Saudi Arabia, the key states in the Arab world, when you look at Morocco, these countries are making a very clear position that the continuation of the settlements, of the occupation, of the conflict, has a very deep price on what Israel cannot do with them. So Israel is facing a very unique opportunity now to totally reshape its relation with the Middle East, but without moving on the Palestinian track. What it gets is a limited prize. Yes, the UAE prize is a significant one, but we could have gotten 20 more countries like that, and we don't. Okay, maybe we get Bahrain as well. Okay, so that's something to remember. And finally, the issue is, like Yael said, it's an internal issue. Whatever the international community does, whether it's incentive or pressures or selling the Palestinians or not, eventually the Israeli interest is to get to the two-state solution, no matter what the UAE and others are doing. And that's something that the Israeli public should understand. And of course, it helps our cause when we can deliver very clear benefits beyond the immediate Palestinian relations to make people support peace. But the case is that if Israel wants to be a Jewish and democratic state and to live in peace with its immediate neighbors in its region, that's what it has to do. And that's the case that we should make.
Nimrod, can I just ask you a follow-up question to that? Because I don't want to put words in either of your mouths, but I feel that we, and when I say we, our camp, in the diaspora in Israel, has always worked on the premise that, I can hear my own voice here, that the kind of Western world wants Israel to make peace with the Palestinians, and it can't accept an undemocratic Israel, and it can't accept, and the Arab world can't accept Israel occupying the Palestinian people, and because of those two pressures, eventually something will change. And I guess we're now in a situation where, Netanyahu has got a lot of allies in the West and in the Arab world who are not democratic, who don't really care about democracy, he has the support and the friendship of Donald Trump, of Bolsonaro, of now the UAE. I don't think that any of these leaders or any of these countries are kind of the shining light of democracy as we kind of imagine it. And are we now in a situation where, and I guess just to kind of pick up the Yael's point, where we have to completely rethink that this idea that because we all care about the Palestinians and we all care about democracy, those things will eventually force the situation to change. That doesn't seem true anymore, or the reality anymore, and I think we've been proved wrong maybe. And so if that is correct, where do we go from here? I guess that's my final question to you both, that, you know, is everything we've imagined the last 20 years, you know, wrong? And if it is wrong, then I don't think it's wrong, but have we kind of made assumptions that have now been proven wrong? And if that is the case, then how do we rethink and how do we recalibrate for the world in which we now live?
The international pressure didn't work. And those anticipating that the pressure from Arab countries or from Europe will make a change, I think it was very clear that this is not the case. No, the European Union does not have a consensus anymore on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Since 2016, there has not been a single statement by the Foreign Affairs Council agreed by consensus of all member states on Israel. You know, Hungary and others are blocking one statement or initiative after another. So the EU could not have been an effective player anymore on that. No, Arab pressure was not the case anyway. You know, the only time when you had effective international pressure on Israel, it came from Washington. And with this administration, you cannot anticipate it. I'm not sure whether a Biden administration will be willing to go for that. But don't accept it to be from either from Europe or from the Middle East. I think what is important is the erosion of democracy. That's becoming a foreign policy issue. The new alliances that Netanyahu has been forming with Orban and the like, some of the people you mentioned, I think reflects a big change in the nature of Israel. And that's a new mobilizing factor. You know, people who do not really care about the Palestinian issue in Israel may care more about democracy. And for us, I think these two issues are linked together. When someone cares about the democratic nature of Israel, it's very easy to take the conversation next to what happened with the Palestinians. So people, I think, are reflecting on reality and are looking for different channels. I still think that the two-state solution is the most feasible one with all the hardships, and I will not be among those saying the solution is dead and we have to look for other alternatives. I think the other alternatives are not in any way either easier or better addressing the needs of both societies. So with all the difficulties, our goal is to keep pushing for that and to look how international community could be more effective in delivering it. So you need to have new multilateral mechanism pushing the peace process forward. You definitely need to have a different American administration practicing different diplomacy. You need to empower pro-peace Israeli politicians. You need to empower the new Palestinian leadership, which will take over the Palestinian Authority in a few months or years. And you have to leverage and see how the Arab world, with its changing tide with Israel, and we have to acknowledge that the relation between the Arab countries, whether open or not, are very different than they've been a decade ago. And to reflect that, you need to take all these key documents on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, most of which were drafted almost 20 years ago, and bring them up to date. You know, the Quartet roadmap for 2003, the Arab Peace Initiative from 2002, Clinton Parameters 2001, Geneva Initiative 2003, these are the documents. If you look at recent years, you only have the Trump plan. We need new documents that reflect regional realities, domestic needs, and chart a new path for peace, both from within and from the international community.
Here. Let me be brief because I know that we are supposed to end. Hannah, I think that first of all we have to admit that we don't have answers. And perhaps it's something that is easier for a woman to admit. No offense to Nimrod in particular, who's a very special man, but it's very hard in Israel to see beyond Netanyahu, really, on the one hand. On the other hand, I just came back to Tel Aviv, where I live, 2 hours ago, and on Saturday I was driving in the north, in very sort of peripheral areas in the northern part of Israel, and bridge after bridge after bridge, there were people standing with Israel flags and with black flags, you know, demonstrating for democracy and against corruption. And it's one of the most energizing and amazing things that is happening currently in Israel. And there's other demonstrations, but I just want to, in particular, shed light or highlight this Black Flags movement, that is now, I don't know, maybe it's 8 or 9 weeks already, maybe probably more, that people every Saturday, not your usual demonstrators, are going, whether they're in some really remote village in the mountains, are getting out of their house and standing at a junction and waving their flags and sending their messages against our, basically against Netanyahu, I mean, more than anything else, and against what he's doing to our system. So I'm saying it's very hard to see beyond him, but the day will come, and a lot of things I think will change once he's out of office and out of his leadership position, and a lot of opportunities will open. And I think that yes, some of the assumptions, some of the things that the peace camp in Israel and in Palestine was worked on are no longer valid. The world has changed, but there's also an action and reaction. And I just want to take a minute to highlight what is happening in the US, which is what I'm more focused on. I'm sure that it happens in the UK and in other ways, but I'm less of an expert on that. But in the US, you see that Trump has caused the reaction that we see in the Democratic Party, and that we see in activism, and we see it in the positions in the Democratic Party on Israel-Palestine have moved so quickly in the last, in the last just few months around the annexation conversation, in ways that, at least with JSHIT, which I've been working for almost 10 years, it's been so difficult. But then the reaction to Trump is so strong, and I don't think that Biden, if he will be elected, inshallah, he wouldn't want to deal with this issue. That wouldn't be his first priorities, but he might be forced to because of his base, and so that's also something to work on. And somebody wrote here in the chat about British Jews and how they'll be affected by everything that is happening here. I want to say that that's also something that hasn't been part of the conversation here, that hasn't been part of the Israel-Palestine sort of dialogue, and the relationship with the diaspora and the actions and the initiatives that have been like BDS, that has come from the outside and is a significant thing that has happened in the last decade, all also mean that we have to find new ways of working and creating processes that are much more global in a way, but are not about bringing pressure from outside necessarily, but about taking into account all the different players that are seriously affected by what is happening here, and giving that respect and a seat around the table. I can say a lot more about that, but we need to end. So I'll just say that we have a lot of work ahead of us, and it's very exciting actually that maybe this era is also a time for really reevaluating and then coming out on the other side of this with new ways of promoting peace and the two-state solution and ending occupation.
Thank you very much. It's nice to end on a kind of a hopeful note, because it's quite often in these webinars or the events that we do, you get to the end and everyone goes, oh, that was really interesting, but I'm more depressed than I was when I started. So it's good to hear from both of you that there are kind of glimmers of hope and actually reasons to kind of be positive. Because a lot of what I think people are reading and hearing about this deal is, on the one hand, it's great, but it just leaves, we're just going back to where we were 6 months ago, before annexation was the thing that was really consuming all of us. And that was really kind of difficult, and nothing ever changed. So it's good to hear from both of you that there are kind of paths through this, and that it does offer new opportunities. I want to just thank everybody for logging in. If you want to send this webinar to anyone, it will be up on our Facebook page as a recording. It's been recorded live, and you can just log in and send people the link. But just to say to Nimrod and to Yael, thank you very much. I know it's kind of late in Israel now. It's the problem we have with a very kind of 2-hour gap, is that it's quite difficult to kind of manage these with the timing. But we really appreciate your friendship and your partnership and the kind of solidarity. And I think it's really important actually that these relationships exist between kind of Israeli and diaspora organizations, and that we kind of strengthen them. And I feel that certainly in the last 6 months, we've all been working really hard and very collaboratively. And a lot of that doesn't get seen in public, but behind the scenes, there's been a lot of discussions between diaspora and kind of Israeli initiatives about how we collectively kind of work our way through this difficult period. And I think that in what, you know, one of the positives that's come out of that is that I think that those relationships have really been strengthened, and that's to our collective benefit. So we're looking forward to continuing to work with you, whatever the kind of territory looks like, and I'm sure that we will be speaking to you again soon. So thank you, and have a good evening, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.